Look at this. Last month, I spent 400 on grocery and now it is 520. How do prices go up so much?
And our income have not increased. If we spend more, we run out of money. If we spend less, we can't buy anything we want. Inflation are really affecting our consumption.
This is what we are exploring in our vlog. How rising inflation change household consumption patterns. Using data and econometric models, we will analyze how income and prices influence spending.
My name is EIA2013 I will explain, does inflation affect household consumer spending in Malaysia? An econometric analysis on relationship between inflation and consumption. Inflation in Malaysia fluctuates over the years, and this change has directly affected the purchasing power of households. As the price of goods and services continue to rise, consumers often forced to adjust how they spend their income. However, despite this visible change in the price, the actual extent to which inflation influences household consumption behavior is still not fully clear. Some households may reduce spending, while others shifting their spending priorities instead. Therefore, this study aims to investigate whether in Malaysia's inflation rate have a significant impact on household consumer spending. By using econometric model, we seek to measure both the strength and the direction of relationship between inflation and household consumption.
Good day everyone, my name is Jerusha and I am a Household Economics Research Analyst from World Bank Malaysia office. I'll be presenting the objectives and the background theory for our study titled, Does Inflation Affect Household Consumer Spending in Malaysia? Let me begin with the objectives of the study. First, the study aims to examine the relationship between inflation and household consumer spending in Malaysia. This helps us understand how changes in price levels influence the spending behavior of Malaysian households. Second, we aim to identify whether rising prices cause households to reduce, increase, or maintain their current level of spending. This is important because households may respond differently depending on their income level and spending priorities. Third, the study also seeks to determine which categories of household spendings are most affected during periods of inflation. For example, we want to observe whether spending on necessities such as food and transport changes differently compared to non-essential items. And finally, we aim to provide empirical evidence using econometric methods to support the relationship between inflation and consumer spending in Malaysia. As the World Bank, we place strong emphasis on data-driven and evidence-based analysis. Overall, as part of the World Bank's economic analysis, these objectives helps us understand how inflation influences the financial well-being of Malaysian households. Next, I'll briefly explain the first key concept, which is inflation. Inflation refers to a general increase in the price of goods and services over time. When inflation rises, the purchasing power of households decreases because the same amount of money is able to buy fewer goods and services. In Malaysia, inflation may occur due to several factors. These include higher global commodity prices, exchange rate depreciation, and increased production costs. When these costs rise, they are often passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. Because of this, households face greater financial pressure, especially when the prices of essential goods continue to increase. The World Bank monitors inflation trend closely because rising prices directly impact household welfare and increase the risk of financial vulnerability and poverty. Household consumption refers to total household spending on goods and services such as food, transport, housing, healthcare, and recreation. It plays a major role in Malaysia's economy. Inflation affects households' consumption by reducing real income and forcing households to adjust to their spending behavior. Essential spending often remains stable, while non-essential spending may decrease during periods of high inflation. Households may also switch to cheaper alternatives known as the substitution effect. In addition, if households expect prices to rise further, they may increase current spending to avoid higher prices later. By analyzing these patterns, the World Bank can provide evidence-based policy recommendation to help Malaysian households cope with inflation. That concludes my presentation on the objectives and the background theory of our study.
For this study, we use several reliable data sources and software to ensure the accuracy and consistency of our analysis. The main software we use is eView, which was utilized for econometric modeling and data analysis. In addition, Microsoft Excel was used for data cleaning, data organization, and preliminary analysis. In terms of data sources, we rely on official and credible institutions. These include the Department of Statistics Malaysia, Bank Negara Malaysia, and the World Bank, which provide macroeconomic and financial data. Overall, the use of these software tools and trusted data sources help us improve the reliability and validity of our research findings. As we can see on this slide, it explains the process of analysis of the economic model used in our study. First, we begin with economic theory to identify the relationship between the variable. Based on this theory, we then develop an econometric model. Next, we collect the relevant data and proceed with model estimation. After that, we conduct specification tests and diagnostic checking to ensure that the model is appropriate and reliable. If the data is found to be adequate, we continue with hypothesis testing. Finally, the validated model is used for prediction and policy analysis to support our conclusions.
This slide represents the econometric model used in the study. We specify a simple linear regression model as consumption at time t is a function of constant base level BO plus some effect from the inflation rate at that time, B1 inflation t plus an arrow term ET. The objective of this model is to examine how inflation affects household consumption over time. Household consumption is the dependent variable, while inflation is the independent variable. By estimating this model, we are able to test economic theory using real data and quantify the impact of inflation on consumption behavior. Next, I will explain the variable included in the model. Consumption T refers to the total household consumption in the year T. Inflation T represents the annual inflation rate in Malaysia. The constant term, BO, captures the average level of consumption when inflation is zero. The coefficient B1 measures the marginal effect of inflation on household consumption. The arrow term, ET, included all other factors affecting consumption that are not explicitly captured in the model, such as income, interest rate, and consumer confidence. Fact, the present of regression result we obtained by using EViews using the ordinary least square method. The dependent variable is household consumption with inflation as the explanatory variable. The estimated coefficient for inflation is 1.704251, indicating a positive relationship between inflation and consumption. The p-value associated with inflation is 0.0430, which is statistically significant at the 5% level. This suggests that inflation have a statistically significant impact on household consumption in Malaysia during the period. Interpretation of slope coefficient estimated the regression equation as consumption T equals to 2.108383 plus 1.704251 inflation T. The slope of coefficient as 1.704251 means that 1 unit increases in inflation leads to an average increase about 1.7 units of household consumption, holding other factors constant. This result indicates as a positive relationship between inflation and consumption, which may reflect household increasing nominal spending in response to rising prices. After that, we evaluate the godness of fit of the model. It adjusted the R-squared values of 0.3124, meaning that approximately 31.24% of the variation in household consumption is explained by inflation. It indicates a moderate explanatory power, which is reasonable given that consumption is influenced by many other factors beyond inflation alone. Therefore, while inflation plays an important role, additional variables would be needed to further improve the model's explanatory strength.
On this slide, we begin our t-test analysis to determine if inflation has statistically significant impact on consumption. We set up two hypotheses. The null hypothesis H0, which assumes inflation has no effect, and the alternative hypothesis H1, which states that it does. Looking at the data table, the coefficient for inflation is 1.704, indicating a positive relationship, while the statistic is 2.354. However, to reach a final conclusion, we must look at the p-value of 0.0430, shown in the last column. So now we're moving to the interpretation. We calculate the t-statistic by dividing the estimate coefficient by its standard error, which gives us approximately 2.355. Our final decision is based on the p-value rule. If the p-value is less than or equal to our 0.05 significant level, we reject the null hypothesis. So, since our p-value of 0.043 is indeed less than 0.05, we have strong evidence to reject the null hypothesis. This confirms that inflation is a statistically significant predictor of consumption in our model.
For the F-test, we assess the overall statistical significance of the regression model. Null hypothesis state that inflation has no effects on household consumption, while the alternative hypothesis state that inflation does affect consumption. The probability values of the F statistic is 0.04298, which is less than the 5% significant level. Therefore, we reject the null hypothesis. It indicates that the overall regression model is statistically significant and inflation is an important determinant of household consumption.
Good day everyone, my name is Jessica Manajimi and I am Economic Data Analysis. Today, I'm here to share critical insight into Malaysia economy performance over the past decade. My role involves analyzing macroeconomic indicators and household consumption patterns to understand the factors driving our economy. I work with data from reputable sources like the World Bank and the Department of Statistics Malaysia to provide evidence-based insight. To build a comprehensive analysis, I have gathered data from two primary sources. From the World Bank, we are analyzing inflation CPI percentage, which measure annual price changes across the economy. This indicator helps us understand purchasing power and cost of living pressures. From the Department of Statistics Malaysia (DOSM), we are tracking household final consumption measured in RM billions. This reflects actual household spending levels and reveals consumer confidence trends. Together, these two indicators show a complete picture of economic health that's showing us both price pressure and consumer behavior across the decade from 2014 to 2024. Now, let us analyze the Malaysia inflation journey. The data show 5 distinct paths. From 2014 to 2017, we experienced moderate inflation from 2% to 4%, with 2017 peaking at 4%, which is the highest point in the decade. This reflects steady economic growth with manageable price increases. 2018 to 2019 marked a period of extremely low inflation, dropping below 1% in 2018 and settling at just 0.6% in 2019. Consumers enjoyed stable prices during this period. However, 2020 showed deflation where the inflation fell to negative 1.2%. This was the first deflationary period in nearly 30 years, driven by the COVID-19 pandemic's economic shock. By 2021 to 2022, inflation rebounded sharply to 3.3%, reflecting post-pandemic recovery and supply chain pressures. Finally, 2023 to 2024 shows moderation, with inflation easing to 2.4% in 2023 and further to 1.8% in 2024, moving closer to the central bank's target range. Next, we analyze how this inflation trend affected household spending behavior. From 2014 to 2019, household consumption showed strong positive growth, steadily increased from 5.85 billion to 7.98 billion. Families feel confident and spend comfortable despite moderate inflation pressures. The 2020 COVID-19 shock was dramatic and consumption dropping to negative 3.94 billion. This reflects the economic shutdown experienced during lockdowns and households sharply reduced spending on non-essential as uncertainty increased. Recovery began in 2021 with a slight rebound to 1.79 billion, reflecting tentative confidence as vaccination rates increased. 2022 brought a stronger recovery, with consumption jumping to 11.32 billion, exceeding pre-pandemic levels. This reflects deeper demand and improving economic confidence. 2023 saw stabilization at 4.65 billion, suggesting a stabilization as high inflation initially constrained purchasing power. Looking at 2024, consumption is rising again to approximately 5.10 billion, indicating that as inflation moderates, household spending confidence is gradually returning. In conclusion, Malaysia's economy has proven its resilience. Despite external shocks and rising prices, households have adapted, and consumer spending is steadily recovering. This shows a clear sign that the economy is on the path to recovery.
On this slide, we can see the trend of inflation and household consumption from 2014 to 2024. From 2014 to 2019, both inflation and consumption were relatively stable. This shows a normal economic condition where spending patterns did not change much. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, both inflation and consumption dropped sharply. Inflation became very low, even negative at some point, while household consumption fell to its lowest level because people spend less due to uncertainty and movement restrictions. In 2021 and 2022, the economy started to recover. People began spending more again and inflation increased as prices rose. However, in 2023 and 2024, both inflation and consumption started to slow down. Inflation became lower and household consumption also declined slightly. Overall, this graph suggests that inflation has consumption trend tend to move together over time. Last but not least from us, to conclude this study examined with the inflation effect household consumption. So, based on the economic theory, rising prices reduce purchasing power and can change consumer spending behavior. Using data from 2014 to 2024 and an econometric regression model, we found that inflation has a positive and significant impact on the household consumption. The trend in Malaysia also supports this finding as both inflation and consumption dropped sharply in 2020 and recovered in 2021 and 2022. Overall, the results confirm that inflation does influence household spending. Understanding this relationship is important for policymakers in designing policy to support household welfare and economic stability. That's all from us. Thank you.